Hey folks, Damian Mason coming at you. Before we hop into another fantastic episode of the Business of Agriculture, I want to tell you about Pattern Ag. Pattern Ag is a company that has pioneered predictive soil analytics. You know, we always treated diseases and pests after they were already in the field, when they were already causing us a problem. But what if you can do this proactively through predictive soil analytics? Pattern has a technology that through their technology, you can say, oh, here's the likelihood that I'm going to have soybean cyst nematode. Here is the prediction on how bad of a risk I face for sudden death syndrome or corn rootworm and a whole bunch of other diseases and pests. When you know what your risk factor is, you can more efficiently and proactively treat for the disease. You can do this by going to pattern.ag and figuring out what your risk factors are through predictive analytics. That's right. Go to www.pattern.ag and then get a hold of your Pattern Ag representative to help you do predictive analytics on your farming operation. Well, hey there. Welcome to another fantastic episode of the Business of Agriculture. Got a great program for you today. We are talking about soybeans, renewable diesel, and the fervor over the future of soybeans. If you have not heard this, I'm going to be the first one to share it with you. In agricultural America, we love production. We love the excitement that comes along with the anticipation of more demand for our product. Because what do we love to do in ag? We love to produce stuff. Well, there's been certain rumors going around that renewable diesel is going to take every acre of soybeans we can produce. This year, that'd be about 88 million acres worth. Also, then there's the idea that we're going to need 18 million more additional acres of soybeans in the next few years to satisfy the hungry beast known as renewable diesel. My friend Mac Marshall, who is the VP of Market Intelligence for United Soybean Board, spoke at a conference recently that I was also hired to speak at. And I said, you got to come on the Business of Agriculture podcast and talk about that, China, yields, and so much more as it relates to soybeans. So back for a second time, my friend with the United Soybean Board, Mac Marshall. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be here, Damian. Although I got to say, I'm a little remiss. Last time I was on, I got the intro of being the best looking guy in soybeans. So I don't know what's happened in the last year, but I'm going to try to make up lost ground.
Well, you are wearing a vest that's very trendy and cool, and you are still a very fit guy, and you're looking the part. When I spoke at a soybean meeting, I've done a few of them, I'd say that you're probably still the most GQ dude in all soybeans. All right, so answer me this. You and I talked about 6 or 8 months ago, you came on and we talked about all things soybeans, talked about where the grind goes, where the crush goes, all this kind of stuff. Soybeans were always a thing in the United States of America that were a protein source to feed hogs, right? Soybean meal. And then we also had soybean oil for human consumption. And now there's this entire new thing, started with biodiesel talk about, a decade or so ago. So I want you to give me a little background on soybeans from your perspective, where we were and where we're going, because in big strokes, and then we'll kind of talk about specifics.
Yeah, definitely. I think to really understand where we are now with this emerging renewable diesel complex, implications for soy and U.S. agriculture as a whole, we really got to look at a much longer history. So if we go back to the 90s, that's when the biodiesel industry in the U.S. Started to get kicked off, some of which was actually funded through checkoff research and investments, back in the 90s. Because, as you said, we've historically produced soybeans for protein, to go into meal, to go into animal rations, primarily chickens and hogs, and to a lesser extent, dairy cattle in the United States. Also a whole bunch of other livestock animals, but that's the vast majority where it goes. And so in the 90s, you crush meal or you crush soybeans and you get meal and you get oil. The question was, okay, well, what are we going to do with all of this oil? We don't have that offtake opportunity. Yes, there's food markets for it, but is there an opportunity for us to approach, the biofuel space and come up with a solution there? And that's basically how biodiesel kind of got kicked off. National Biodiesel Board was funded in the 90s. And then going into the 2000s, biodiesel really started to gain commercial viability. You, of course, had the renewable fuel standard come into play in the mid part of the first decade of the 21st century.
Yeah, 2005, Bush was in office and everybody said, well, he's an oil guy. He's not going to do anything favorable for ag. But the reality is he was in office and he's the one that kind of gets responsibility for creating the renewable fuel standard, which mandated that we have to have a certain amount of the blend that comes from renewable resources, right?
Yeah, and that's the progression that we had over the next couple of years, particularly on the ethanol side, which is primarily made from corn in the United States. We had a tremendous build out underpinned by the renewable fuel standard, which helped bring about the ethanol market for corn. And now where we are, biodiesel has of course grown in importance. A lot of co-location of production of the crop, the crush, and the actual facilities where biodiesel is produced. And it's grown for the total biomass-based diesel market in the United States is now about a 3 billion gallon market. Close to 2 billion gallons of that is traditional biodiesel or fatty acid methyl ester biodiesel. And about 1 billion gallons now is renewable diesel. And I think we got to deconstruct some of the high level differences between those two fuels because when I first heard about renewable diesel, I was kind of thinking of the two of them interchangeably. And I think, there's a lot of confusion. I'm not a chemist by any stretch of the imagination, but basically,
What's your father is?
He a computer scientist.
Oh, I thought okay.
Yeah, just different sorts of equations and numbers and everything. The bottom line is either way, I'm an economist, so more like a fake scientist.
Yeah, so we've had a couple of things here real quickly about since you hopped right straight into biofuels. We did an episode, dear listener, a few months ago with Pete Meyer. He's with he's an analyst in basically in the New York Metroplex that advises investment groups, et cetera, on the whole biofuel space. And then we also had Jeff Cooper, the CEO of the Renewable Fuel Association, that's the ethanol side. And so we've had coverage of this, but it's a big enough thing that we need to do coverage to stay pertinent and relevant here at the Business of Agriculture podcast. What you're getting ready to say is that because ethanol had a head start. Like it's almost like ethanol got to go out and run around the track a couple of times before they even unloaded the soybeans at the track and field event. Ethanol had the money. Ethanol had the renewable fuels standard lobbying going. Maybe soybeans did too. And I'm not bashing on your organization. You're not technically the lobbying group anyhow. But it's like ethanol was already on the third leg of the relay when you guys got off the bus, right? And I'm not being mean. It's just that everybody's talking ethanol. I'm in I-State up here in Indiana. There's 3 ethanol plants within 30 miles of my farm. And then soybeans are kind of like a laggard. And also, we talked about biodiesel. You went to the state fair. This tractor's running on biodiesel. It's the first I even heard about it. And so it never had the kickstart nor the market penetration or anything. So this is, I guess, the exciting part, Mac, is that soybeans are now going to be the in vogue thing, whereas ethanol's been running on the renewable fuel standard demand since 2005. Kind of help me out and correct me if I'm wrong, and then take me from there.
Now, first off, I like the track meet analogy, but maybe let me take it in a different direction. If we want to say that ethanol is, doing the relay race and, running around, the laps there, we're almost competing in a different event, and that's because ethanol is, it's primarily for the on-road gasoline market for passenger vehicles, whereas diesel fuel and by extension biodiesel and now renewable diesel is much more in the long-haul truck and heavy machinery space. So you can think of ethanol maybe as the track meet there, and I don't know what's something that's not track, or not a race. We'll say we're distance.
You're the shot put.
We'll be the shot put. I like that. So now as we think about renewable diesel, it's a different chemical process. It doesn't involve transesterification. Again, highly technical term here, but different chemical process. Transesterification. It's basically how it has to do with the fatty chain construction.
That's how we used to take the oil portion of soy and turn it into combustible product to run tractors and make biodiesel, was through transesterification. And it's my understanding what you're getting ready to tell me next is when we talk about the new concept and the new product, renewable diesel, it's pretty damn different from biodiesel because it's a refined product from the oil. Is that what you're going to tell me?
You said it better than I could. The molecular structure is different. The molecular structure of renewable diesel is chemically equivalent to that of traditional petroleum diesel. Why does that matter? That matters because biodiesel, due to that chemical property difference, you can only blend up to, about 20% in most applications, whereas renewable diesel can, wholesale replace petroleum diesel in most engines.
And isn't that what has most people, aside from the chemistry, which is pretty fascinating, and I'm not a chemist either, but if you are a soybean producer, the exciting part is this is a wholesale replacement for diesel that's refined from crude oil, whereas biodiesel at best was 10% mixing it with regular diesel. This stuff is a different product from the fact that it still it's derived of soybeans, but it's completely refined and handled differently, and it results in a pretty different product.
Yeah, exactly. The end use application is going to be different simply because you don't have to have that same blend wall. And I think a couple other things are worth noting as well in the differences between the two. Now, you mentioned renewable fuel standards, what has underpinned, the development of the ethanol industry and, expansion in the biodiesel space. Whereas with renewable diesel, which on a full life cycle basis, everything from, you plant the soybeans in the ground, you harvest them, the soybeans sequester carbon from the atmosphere into the ground. You eventually use the oil that is crushed from that to produce renewable diesel. Even out of the tailpipe, if it burns the same as traditional petroleum-based diesel, because you've had that carbon sequestration, the total life cycle emissions of renewable diesel versus traditional petroleum diesel, it's about a 74% reduction in total emissions there. This is based off of a lot of empirical research that has been conducted.
So just so I can get the quick math on that, renewable diesel, 74% reduction in emissions compared to
traditional petroleum-based diesel. And it's not just emissions out of the tailpipe, it's the full life cycle of production. That's an important distinction here.
Comparatively, it was February, and even what you would normally say pro-ag media, Fox News, whatever, was reporting new studies that ethanol was worse for the environment than making gasoline from fossil fuels. Of course, we went to find out that study was also partially funded by some environmental groups that are opposed to ethanol and wildlife groups, et cetera. Your study right there, has it been refuted to the environmental groups that decided they don't like the no food for fuel groups? Do they refute your 74% claim?
I mean, see, it's not a claim that I've put out. I mean, I'm referencing a third-party piece of research that has, been peer-reviewed and gone through publication, by associations. But I've not seen pushback on those particular numbers. If anything, where we see pushback is in, the actual downstream utilization of soybean oil and other, fat-based potential energy sources. That's where the food versus fuel question comes up. And,
question. I mean, raging debate. People come on court. It's been happening for almost 20 years now. Every time the box of cornflakes goes up $1, they blame ethanol. And you're like, do you realize we went from 17 cents of corn in that box of cornflakes to like 21 cents with, don't blame that 4 cents. Don't blame 4 cents back on the farm, for crying out loud. Anyway, the food for fuel thing. I'm going to ask you very frankly, and I know that you're going to put on your United Soybean Board hat. Is it real? I mean, are we really going to use this much soybean product for diesel 3 years, 5 years from now? Is it real, and when does it happen?
So I think there's a lot of things to deconstruct there. First, let's right-size the food market for soybean oil in the United States. It's about 14.5 billion pounds annually, and it's basically been in and around
14.5
billion pounds
of
soybean oil is utilized in the food and other industrial.
14.5 billion pounds. It's interesting, instead of gallons, of soy oil used in just American food consumption.
Yeah, that's just in U.S. Food and other industrial production, and
that's because the person that's answering this, they're saying, "Damn it, I don't use that much soybean oil at home." Tell us why. It's because it's used in so many things, right?
Exactly. It's applications in the food space and the industrial space are incredibly diverse, and you see vegetable oil or soybean oil, in a lot of ingredients. The question is, it's not really used in high volumes outside of a couple products like, margarines and salad dressings. So, first right sizing that market size, I think is important. And we produce about 25, 26 billion pounds of soybean oil annually. So the majority usage channel is that food space. Now, we are growing our soybean oil use in the biofuel space. USDA is putting this year's usage in the 11 to 12 billion pounds range. You see that, vacillate from month to month. But by and large, it's still not the majority usage.
You're saying 11. So if we do 25 and we produce 14, so about 11 billion this year is going to go to fuel.
Yeah, those are the USDA figures.
So the bulk of it still goes to soy oil for human consumption, food ingredients, and as you said, some industrial applications. But then there's a pretty significant amount, like still around 40%, that's going to go to make fuel, right?
Right. But I think there's a couple other ththings to consider here. One, we're just talking oil. We haven't considered the meal fraction here. So if we're talking about soy's whole contribution towards food production, remember, only 19, 20% of the volume of a bean is going to go into the oil fraction. You've got 79% of it going into the meal fraction, and 97% of the meal that we produce in this country and consume in this country goes into animal ag, which is, of course, for producing animal protein. So you look at that full usage channel, while we're growing use for soybean oil in the biofuel space, being driven by growth in renewable diesel, we've still got, the tremendous overwhelming majority of utilization of the soy complex flowing into the food space. And
so I like that. By the way, I like that answer because there's folks that get confused. What are you going to do about? Are we going to produce about 3.7 billion bushels of soy beans this year, something like that?
So this year we're, I think, up around 4.4 billion. Okay. USDA, took down yields a little bit recently. So now we're looking. So
we did like 4.5 or 4.6 last year. So we got 4.4 billion bushels. Just for the person that's like a cranberry farmer, or my buddy I always reference, that's a suburban Chicago guy, was my buddy in college, roommate in college. He listens to this, and then he was even turned on investors to listen to this. Like, if you want to know what's happening in this ag space, so I always then have to deconstruct it. While a soybean farmer probably knows the numbers you just shared, Mac, 80% of the soybeans produced, of the 4.5 billion bushels we're going to produce, 80% of that goes to hog food. Not necessarily, but it goes to soybean meal, which is dairy rations, beef rations, chicken rations, hog feed. All right, 20% gets made into oil. Of the 20% gets made into oil, about 60% goes to human consumption or industrial application. About 40% goes to the renewable diesel thing. So while we love this idea that we're going to grow a whole bunch more soybeans, the reality is it's only 40% of 20% that's going to go to make diesel.
Yeah. And even once you add in exports and everything as well, just for example, last year, and this is where, I like to defer to metric just because I think it's easier to work with rather than bushels and tons and everything. But last year we produced a crop of about 120 million metric tons. And, total use in the biofuels channel was about 5.5 million tons. Yeah. So it winds up being on a crop equivalent basis, it's about 4%.
So now, about 4% of the soybean crop is right now going to diesel, but the caveat of this is there are signs that we could use way more of it. And that's where I want to ask you about when we come back from this little break. It's not really a break. It's just me telling you about AgVisor Pro. AgVisor Pro is an app you put on your phone. Everybody's got one of these smartphones, right? Mine's sitting right here. Yours is in your pocket. You might be listening to this podcast on your smartphone. Well, you know what? Your smartphone has more technology and capability than the NASA Apollo program had 50 years ago. So why don't you use this technology to your advantage? For example, my buddy Rob Syke, who founded AgVisor Pro, tells me that about 17 to 20% of a farmer's time is spent seeking information and answers to problems or challenges they are facing. AgVisor Pro is a format and a forum to find information, find experts. You can go on there and you can type in, I need an expert on ragweed eradication. Next thing you know, a guy pops up and maybe he'll give you the information for free, or maybe you can just hire him to be a consultant for you for a very short term. It's like an Uber ride, if you will. It's the Uberization of agricultural information. Go to agvisorpro.com and check it out. AgVisor Pro. It's an app. You don't have to go to agvisorpro.com. Just go AgVisor Pro. It's an app on your phone. Put it on there. Check it out. It will help you save time because, as my buddy Rob Syke always says, when you shorten time and distance, you make more money. All right. We were saying, and you were telling me 4%. And right now, of the whole entire U.S. soybean crop goes to renewable diesel. Mr. Marshall, where could this go? Because my buddy Pete Meyer, who was on here, sounded the alarm and got all the people just salivating in their combines. He said, yep, the diesel thing, we can take every acre of soybean you'll produce. And man, oh man, do farmers love to hear that. And you said, oh, that gets people a little jittery. Talk to me.
Yeah. So the supposition that we're going to need, 18, 19, 20 million additional acres of soybeans, let's break that down, because this is where we really have to get in the back of the envelope math, which I think is what is used to actually derive that number. So if you look at the volume of capacity expansions that have been announced for renewable diesel, it, basically projects that if everything gets built and everything gets, utilized at a high capacity utilization rate, you'd be looking at a renewable diesel market size in excess of 6 billion gallons by the end of the decade.
Okay, so right now we're at 3 billion?
3 billion for the whole biomass-based diesel market, which is right now primarily biodiesel, and about 1 billion gallons of that is renewable diesel. So it's
okay.
It's
So right now we're at 3 billion, and only 1 billion of which is this new technology of renewable diesel, which again is a refined, full-on diesel replacement. 2 billions of which of the three is now the old-fashioned biodiesel. You're telling me if we build out the capacity, which means I assume infrastructure to make the crap, right? Okay.
Yeah.
If we do that by the end of the decade, which is only 8 years from now, 7 years, almost 7 years from now, we can do what?
Well, this is where the "if you build it, they will come" analogy from Field of Dreams starts to factor in here. So if you believe that all that incremental capacity will come online, that's of course very exciting. You hear we're growing this to a 6 billion gallon market from 1 billion gallons today. I think anybody who's on the sell side of that is going to be incredibly excited.
Yep.
But the fact of the matter is, you're not just taking soybeans out of the ground and bringing them to a renewable diesel production facility. There's intermediate steps that have to happen, that have to be debottlenecked along the way. So if I go back to the early part of 2021, when we were having these waves of new announcements, I said, this is very exciting. This is still fundamentally a market that is rooted in a decarbonization effort by the state of California. Now, California, of course, is a very important economy. I think it's the world's 5th largest economy if it were separate from the United States. So let's not discount that, but it is still grounded in a state level policy. And what started to get me more excited about the reality of growth in the renewable diesel market was when you started to have a lot of private sector investment come in the crushing space. Right now, I mentioned that crop of 120 million metric tons annually, 4.4 billion bushels annually, thereabout. We're crushing about half of that. And that, creates 25 billion pounds of soybean oil, right? And we've talked about where that goes in terms of uses. So if you're going to actually have all of those future plants, get built, you've got to have the stuff flow into it. And that's a combination of soybean oil and other bio-based, lipids out there. That's
but that would
edible grease. But soybean oil is the best, is the most volumetrically important feedstock. And
that's what I was getting ready to say. So you and I both spoke at the American Fats and Oils Association conference. And there's people that laugh. What the hell are you talking about? The American fat? Yeah, it's a real thing. And also, it's always been about the lipids, the fats, the stuff. When there's a facility that processes hogs, there's a whole bunch of fats and lipids that it gets rendered into something. It ends up being still a usable byproduct. And it's moved from it being, how can we make this into dog food, to how can we make this into fuel? So it does fuel the fuel versus food debate, because now we're talking about this new demand source. You just said we might go from 1 billion of gallons of renewable diesel right now to 6. If you 6 times something, my math says only 4% of all soybean production ends up as renewable diesel. 6 times it, that's 24% of all of the soybeans end up as renewable diesel. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, I think there's more nuances to it than that. But first off, one, not all that announced capacity is going to get built. I've yet to talk with someone in the industry, from any part of it, whether you're talking upstream in the feedstock space or, downstream in the energy space or some of the associations, because the fact of the matter is a lot of what works into the economics of these facilities factors into, the credit market, renewable identification numbers, what you're at, and the credits that you're able to apply as a producer in the state of California are predicated on carbon intensity scores of the feedstock that you're using. Basically, the difference between the impact of carbon being released in the atmosphere through using a feedstock compared to traditional petroleum diesel, and that credit market is there's a finite amount of credits out there, and then as you have more and more production come online, just as anything else in the history of mankind and markets, value ultimately always goes towards commoditization. Value always declines over time as things become commoditized, and credit markets are no different. So once the value of those credits drops off, some of those marginal producers or those announced plants that might not have the same processing economics, those might likely not get built. So I look at that 6.5 billion gallon market potential piece as a top line, and that's capacity. That's not production. That's not feedstock utilization, and that's fully loaded. So I think you've got to apply a sizable discount factor to that, and that is the biggest question, right? So even if we're discounting it, by say 50%, that's still significant growth in the market going forward.
Wait. If you're okay, I get it, everything you're saying, and I thought it was interesting. Everything you say is spot on here, and I don't have any certainly disagreement. You're the expert. Yes, commoditization values, et cetera, et cetera. And so I kind of want to go back to the credits thing. Essentially, and we saw this with ethanol, it gets to where the product, the value, the margin, the profit margin for the company or whatever, there was a while farmers were getting together and building ethanol plants. And then it wasn't quite, because like everything, then when the margin goes away, it's like you need to have more economies of scale, et cetera, et cetera. So you're saying that eventually the margin, the profit margin for renewable diesel will come down to the credit, meaning the environmental credit, the tax credit, what have you. That's what you're saying. And those credits might expire, sunset, or decline?
Well, I think it's that as more and more, again, there's a finite amount that can go around. And there's also a question of, okay, well, how does the California market look to decarbonize itself? Well, it's not just looking at bio-based renewable energy. It's also considering increased electrification as part of the grid, right? As you have increased electrification and more allocation of credits flowing into that, does that draw away from the pool of available credits going to producers who are using, lipids and other oils for producing biofuels? So, there's a finite amount for those to go around where there's still, an ample value that will actually go to the producer. But the point that I really want to hit on here as well is that debottlenecking piece, right? And that's where the announcements of crush capacity expansion are incredibly exciting, that have happened really over the last 18 months or so. You look around the country, I think we've got 18 or 19, the number, tends to be in flux because we have new announcements all the time of expansions of existing facilities or new crush facilities around the country. Now, that might sound like a lot, as we're approaching, 20 new or expanded facilities.
What's the number? The number that's new or expanded is 20, and existing operating right now is?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. I think, It's more than that as far as like actual like crush facilities around the country.
I think I remember that ethanol plants, which again, they were 2 laps around the track before the soy. By the way, you compared to soybean and our whole corn and soy track meet, Mac, you compare them to the shot putters. in my day in track, they called the shover the fat guys. So you're saying the soybeans are the fat kids that have to slowly rumble off the bus, drinking a milkshake, go out and toss a heavy piece of metal called a shot put. The ethanol guys, I mean, let's face it, they kind of out there outrunning you. Anyway, they tell me there's like.
Well, hold on. We're talking about lipids here, okay? So like we want to have a consistent analogy, and
so it's okay to call soybeans the fat kids.
No. I would say the versatile, multi-talented kids, right? Because again, you're producing for lipids and you're producing for protein, right? So these are, I'm going to mix my analogies and metaphors again, but I like to think of sturdy offensive linemen. You draft them, you plug in your anchor tackles for the next decade. That's where we are with beans.
There's no offense. There's no offensive yards if there's not offensive line. So, okay, we'll go with that. You are mixing metaphors, analogies, and sports all at once here on the Business of Ag podcast. That's why you're a versatile guy. Answer me this then. If we do this and we find this new demand, because we will find new demand. This thing about 18 million more new acres that has been bandied about. And I think that's exactly your term. When I was watching you at the conference, you said bandied about. And I'm like, he and I are the only two people that have ever said bandied about that are of our generation. That's like an old person term.
Well, we're old souls, Damian.
Yeah, it's cool. And sometimes old bodies, it hurts. My thing is, I'm like, 18 million more acres. We're gonna plow up the medians and the highways. I mean, I start going like, all right, we could do that. I mean, there's less acres in production now than there were 100 years ago because we're farming the better stuff, and the stuff that was crappy, we put it in CRP, what have you. I think there's 36 million acres in the CRP program last I looked. So there's 18 million acres to get if we wanted to, although it's not necessarily that likely.
I disagree with that. I don't think that's feasible at all.
You disagree that you say that you can't find 18 million more acres, or you're saying it won't happen?
Well, I'm saying both. I'm saying like, yes, could you find 18 million acres of land out there? Sure. But if you're drawing it out of CRP, the fact of the matter is, why is it in CRP in the first place?
It's usually
there because it's going to be less productive.
Yeah.
Moreover, if you look at the economics of this, going back to the credits, those are all predicated on carbon reduction relative to production with fossil fuels. And if you were to plow up land, then you're losing the environmental benefits from which those credits accrue. Now, this is also discounting a couple other things. One, not all that land, not all those facilities are likely to get built and operate at the capacity utilization levels that are assumed that would underpin that 18 million acre expansion. So there's that. Additionally, let's think about the agronomics of all this. Let's rewind a year. Let's rewind a year when we're starting to see anhydrous prices creep up to $1,400 a ton. The question that was very centered in my mind, I think anybody in the world of row crop agriculture in this country is, look, fertilizer and corn, obviously needs a lot of fertilizer. With fertilizer at the price levels it's at or in scarce supply, we might see a huge swing to beans in planting in spring 2022. It
didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. And why is that? Well, as I talked to more and more farmers throughout last fall, and as we actually got into planting season, farmers said, look, I'm doing what I can to manage my nitrogen cycle. Mm-hmm. I am making the agronomic choices to keep my rotation as close to 50% corn and 50% soybeans here. And this is the missing piece. Yes, farmers are business people. You run a podcast, The Business of Agriculture. Farmers make decisions predicated on economics, but they're not the only axis on which they run their operations. You're also striving for an agronomically sound environment as well. Because the fact is, you cannot be economically viable longer term, and nobody farms for just one season. Right. You cannot be economically viable if you're not agronomically viable, and that was the crux of it. Plenty of market signals calling for beans as we were going into the planting last year, but that's not what came to fruition. It's because farmers need to manage their land. So that 18 million incremental acres. I would throw another one in there.
Let me just interject. When you're from the Midwest, farmers in my part of the world love to plant corn. I think they'd pay to do it here in Indiana. I think they would pay to go out and do it. They love it that much. So there's that reason. But yes, this was supposed to be the third time in USDA record keeping which goes back like 100 some years, that we were going to have more soybean acres than corn. And there was people talking that we're going to do soybean following soybean. We're not going to do the rotation. And then as it turns out, it didn't happen. There was another thing. It wasn't just the nitrogen cycle and the agronomics. The economics ended up tilting back to still being profitable for corn, because even at elevated fertility prices, the price of corn was up as well. So there was that factor as well.
Yeah, no, that was definitely, and certainly as we approach planting season, we had the disruptions out of the Black Sea. Ukraine, of course, being the fourth largest corn exporter globally. Overall risk premium shooting up. You saw price levels for commodities of all classes, ag, industrials, and energy, all significantly higher. And on the revenue side, corn looked appealing, but you got to pencil it out. And we saw farmers stick pretty close to that 50-50.
So I want to throw, they did. And we were at 80, I think the USDA number was 87 or 87.
Yeah, we were like 87.5, I think, for
87.5 million acres of soybeans and about 89.9, of corn. So corn was a couple million more acres planted than soybeans, which is pretty standard. Although neither of the numbers got over 90, and we have been over 90 on both a couple of times, haven't we?
Yeah, and this is more to the point. It's like if we're for both crops, you're faced with the highest futures prices at planting than you've seen in close to a decade.
Why didn't we grab 5 more million acres this year when you got $7 corn and you could have sold $15 beans? You'd think it's going to be over 90 million acres of each, and it was not.
Right, and that's what I would push back to these claims to say we're not environmentally stewarding the land, or we're trying to pull up to plant too much of a particular row crop. Well, no, acreage is down relative to where it's been. We've restored forest land over the last 20 years. Farmers are producing more efficiently on a relatively fixed area footprint. We don't have the luxury of bringing more land into production. And even if we did, it would be irresponsible. Our farmers are efficient, and they take a lot of pride in doing that. And that all goes back to this intersection of agronomics and economics. And that's at the crux of what our farmers are doing.
While we're on the thing about acres, Mac, 1919, 103 years ago, there was 113,000 acres of soybeans in the United States of America. We just said there's 87.5 million this year. We were at 113,000. So we've 800 times or whatever that number is. I can't do that in my head right now. Our output of, I'm sorry, not our output, that certainly that as well, but our production acres. There is this thing that I always point out. We didn't really grow soybeans to any appreciable amount until after World War II, and really the 50s and 60s when it became a thing, 60s even. Will we get to like 100 million though? Do you think that really the shine is going to come off some other stuff? And the genetics, can we get 6 or 8 more million? Can we grow to that because there's the demand, do you think?
I think it's a much longer term question. As we see climactic zone shift and agronomic zone shift, does that move the land in which you can plant soybeans?
Yeah, soybeans are being produced in North Dakota. When I was even in high school, 35 years ago, there was no such thing as soybeans in North Dakota. There just wasn't. And now there is. And that's because of genetics, evolution, some climatological shifts, et cetera. Do we grab another 10% of soybean acres in the next decade?
Well, I think it's hard for me to see us getting to that place. Part of what has, enabled long-term cropping shifts in the U.S., and I'll focus on, the 3 major row crops of corn, soy, and wheat. As you've seen corn and soy expansion happen significantly over the last 25 years, it's primarily been at the expense of wheat acres. And now, why is that? That has to do with, where private sector investment has been. Wheat has historically been a crop that has relied off of public genetic banks. Whereas you've had
this is the problem with you, is that you're in the ag business and you don't take in alternate sources of media. If you had read like you were supposed to, what was the source? Oh, The Atlantic. The Atlantic had a big article this summer that said U.S. ag policy is starving people in the third world countries because we're paying people to plant corn for ethanol instead of wheat to go and feed the poor people in Africa. You didn't see the article. I did. By the way, that's all complete and 100% bullshit. We are growing corn because we're better at it, because the economic return for it, et cetera, et cetera. We can go through all the real reasons that happens. We got better corn. You can grow corn on worse acres where we used to put wheat because wheat can grow in a parking lot. We got all those reasons, not to mention the old thing called profit incentive. But yes, according to the Atlantic, we were starving because we want to kill people by not feeding them. That was the whole gist of the Atlantic article. You didn't see that.
Well, the whole notion of comparative advantage, right? When you talk about international trade and any two sets of trading partners get together, the more efficient outcome you're going to have is if I'm better at producing any entity, be it corn, be it a tire, be it
best thing in the world. The best thing in the world is if you grow soybeans and you let me grow widgets, and then we trade, because I can make widgets better than anybody else in the world, and you can make soybeans better than anyone else in the world. Then we should trade up and we should meet up.
And maybe I'm good at making widgets, but if I'm better at growing soybeans, yes, and I can allocate more resources towards that, and you're better at growing widgets than you are at growing soybeans, you allocate your resources towards the widgets, you're achieving economies of scale, I'm achieving economies of scale. We've formulated an international trading partnership, and we're collectively better off. I mean, I will always, believe that when it comes to comparative advantage economics and international trade. Moreover, the fact of the matter is we still export a lot of corn. We export a lot of beans. We also export a lot of wheat. But wheat you can grow in many, many, many corners of the world. On an acreage basis, it's the most globally grown crop in the world.
Yeah.
You have, I think 7 or 8 major export hubs globally for wheat. Mm-hmm. You don't have that same luxury for corn or soy. You have certain countries that are incredibly efficient in producing those. Yeah. And that's what
us in Brazil, certainly, and to another degree, Argentina on soybeans. Hey, I like the economic discussion here, but I want to make sure our listeners don't get bored, because we really did talk about all things soybeans. You know what we didn't do? We did not get to China. And here's what we're going to do because of time constraints. I want to have you come back in the next couple of months, because I'm doing more and more on China, and I'm doing more and more about the threat of China and the threat to our economy and the threat to the global system from China. And I believe that soybeans are a tool and or a weapon in that battle, if you will, or in that discussion.
We saw that empirically a couple of years ago.
I want to have you come back and talk about that in the future. Let's close out on this thing right here. You hedged your bet when I kept asking you, are we going to grow 8 million more acres of soybeans? You played the bureaucrat there and didn't really give me a yes or a no. You talk about production. From your standpoint, is there any, I know you got to be all positive. Is there anything that you see that is a negative about this new source? Because I'm going to say we got crude oil. Let's just go and frack in North Dakota and not even have this discussion about all this soybean stuff. And nobody's going to fight us for food, for fuel. That doesn't seem like that's got the political wheels, because it's all about renewables. But what am I missing? Anything?
We got to look longer term, and I really think of this as just kind of a full ecosystem that's operating together. That's why, people are only concerned about food security, and food security is incredibly important. I talk a lot about global food security, but it's within the context of ensuring food security while with transportation stability, right? If you're concerned about the price of food, be it domestically or internationally, it's not just about production, it's about distribution and transportation, manufacturing. Mm-hmm. All of that requires energy, which is why you have to think about food and energy as a complex here. Now, if we want to talk about, petroleum and say, hey, like we can burn a whole lot more here, let's think about the longer term implications of that. As we've got a warming planet and increased severity of weather events, we had a drought last summer. We had a lot of production difficulties this summer. Last year in South America, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, lost 30 million tons of production from a second consecutive La Nina. Mm-hmm. All of the major oilseed crops over the last, 4 or 5 seasons have had some disruption or another, Canada and canola, Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, and palm oil, the Black Sea, not just the conflict, but also, a dry crop that was short a couple of years ago that hit the EU as well. These are all weather related. And as we have more and more volatile weather that is brought on by climate change and an ever increasing temperature of the planet, that becomes disruptive to our agricultural production. And that's the thing where we can't just focus on the short term and the nearby because of what's available and convenient. We have to be looking longer term for what's going to be strengthening our overall complex, so that the reversals that we've seen in global food security levels, that the reversal of the trend where we've been having a more food insecure planet over the last couple of years, we need to reverse that trend again so that we're continually on a decline there. But that's going to be brought together by a confluence of factors. And I think, combating climate change is a pivotal one as we think about the real challenges for humanity in the 21st century.
Well, here's the thing. I had Joe talk about soybeans, and the big question is the yields are going to be down. So this year, will we satisfy everybody? We're going to have enough. We're going to have enough to feed the hogs and enough to feed the biofuel complex.
Yeah, I mean, this year, we're also on the path of seeing expansion in crush, and we're seeing expansion in the downstream facilities as well on the energy side. But it's that crush piece, bringing it back to kind of the food and fuel complex. That's the missing piece here. As we're crushing more and more for oil, we're also going to be producing a lot more meal, and that's good for the animal ag complex. I'd love to go longer form on that.
Last question then. Will next year be the year that we put more acres out of soybeans than corn in the United States of America?
We're still so far off from.
I have my prediction that it's going to happen next year. That the prognosticators were a year off, and I think there's going to be a few reasons, including the fertility issue, fertilizer and availability issues, and then some weather issues. That's my prediction. But anyway, I'm going to have you back to talk about that some more. I can talk to you all day, and I don't say that about most people because if you know me, I don't like most people, but I like you. All right. Your name's Mac Marshall. If you want to find him, dear listeners, how do they find you? They go to unitedsoybean.org, right?
Unitedsoybean.org, ussoy.org. Also encourage you to check out some of our partner sites at sniglobal.org. That's the Soy Nutrition Institute for a lot of people who might have questions about soy nutrition applications in human food, as well as usec.org to learn about what we're doing around the globe for market development. And
because after all, you are the checkoff program for soybeans, and you do a pretty damn good job compared to some of the checkoff programs I have observed. I'd say the soybean people do an outstanding job, and I'm not going to tell you the ones that I think don't, but I'm going to tell you that the soybean people do a good job. But his name is Mac Marshall. He's going to come back, and we're going to talk about the China situation and how soy is going to be, I think, one of the biggest pieces of chess pieces on the board when that thing gets going. And we're going to talk about other stuff because he's a good talker and he has incredible information. So thanks for being here, my friend.
No, thanks for having me, and looking forward to the next time we're on.
All right. Till next time, this is Damian Mason, and this is The Business of Agriculture. Well, that concludes another fantastic episode of The Business of Agriculture. This episode was brought to you by Pattern Ag. Everybody in agriculture understands the importance of soil health. We also keep an eye on our soil better than we ever did through advanced soil testing. But what if there was a company that provided predictive analytics, not just checking out nutrients and all the elements that are in there, but also could tell you the degree of risk you face with disease and pest pressure? That's right, Pattern Ag can do that. They actually can tell you, hey, you're going to have a real issue here. You can proactively treat for corn rootworm or cyst nematode or sudden death syndrome before the problem actually starts costing you yield. Go to pattern.ag, that's www.pattern.ag, to find the nearest rep that can help you start doing better for your soil.